Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk. This is going to be very interesting for a lot of people who are interested in DevOps, but then also Angular specifically. And this is a real case study, regardless of theoretical, concepts. So we're going to talk about mastering the monorepository and how NX basically helped me transform 80 plus Angular projects. What were the challenges that I faced, and how did we solve them? But before getting started, I want you to scan this particular link, which is essentially a feedback app, which you can give me feedback through on how you liked the whole talk. And you can also add comments as well. So I'm going to give this a couple of seconds while you use your camera to basically open the link, and then we'll get started. Awesome. We can move forward now. So I want you to imagine 80 plus Angular projects that you need to work with. And I want to ask you, have you been in a situation where you had to update multiple projects altogether? I'm not talking about 80 projects, but maybe 5, 6, 10 projects. Have you been in that situation? And obviously, one of the biggest challenges is when you really have to make sure that the whole UI is consistent throughout the applications that you're working with. So you could be working in a mono repository, or you might be using, let's say, a package that is published on npm or your own registry, but you need to ensure that all of those projects use the right package and are consistent when it comes to UX. Well, for the next half an hour almost, we're going to talk about exactly this. Now, before we get started, I want you to think about why should you care about this talk. And I already have the answer for that. And that is because after a lot of experience and a lot of hard work, I was actually able to convince Google, or at least one of the products of Google, that I am an expert. And then it happened. It started showing me recommendations like this on YouTube, where it says, not everyone should code. So, Google and YouTube, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. But, anyways, just kidding. So, a quick introduction of who I am. I am Mohammad Ahsan Ayaz. I am a GDE in Angular. I'm originally from Pakistan. I live in Sweden at the moment. And I'm working as a software architect at Scania Group at the moment. And I'm also the founder of VisionWise. I'm also the author of 2 worldwide published books, and one of which is this recent one. This is called the Angular Cookbook, which is updated to Angular 17. And now Angular 18 is coming up and is going to be updated for Angular 18 as well. And because of what I'm talking in this session, it is so easy for me to now update all the 80 projects together that would have taken me, I don't know, even a month, that I can just do it in a couple of hours at max. Now, what in the actual schematics are we talking about? So today we are going to talk about how it saved me tens of hours, if not hundreds, working on the Angular Cookbook second edition. What were the challenges and how did I solve them? So let's talk about the problem. In 2019, I published this book called the Angular Cookbook, and it has gotten, I think, more than 46 or 48 reviews on Amazon. It still has got 4.1 or 4.2 rating, which means people really, really liked it. And when working on the second edition, I had to deal with 80 recipes. So the cookbook's sort of architecture is, in terms of the book, when you read it, you're given a problem, you have some steps to follow, just like a recipe, and then you end up with a solution. So it's a very practical, very fast paced book, but you can obviously go on your own pace. But it's not that you have to spend days on understanding something and then you code something. It's really quick. But 80 recipes or 80 plus recipes means 80 plus Angular projects. And that is a lot, to be honest. Now, one of the challenges that I immediately faced when I published the book, and as you know about Angular, Angular has a predictive release cycle. So every 6 months, there is a major release. Now, updating all the recipes, all the projects, whenever there's an update to Angular, it's almost like this. It's very slow. I would have to dedicate the whole month maybe to update all the projects to ensure every project works, nothing is broken, because obviously it's important for the readers as well. And having a full-time job and then also managing this with a family, I think it's really, really tough. And technology is obviously there to make our lives easier, not tough. So what was the solution? I'm really glad that I stumbled upon NX, which is one of the best tools out there, I think, today for working with web applications, whether you're working with Angular, React, and especially if you're working with monorepositories and you care about CI/CD. Now, the solution is that we have two NX workspaces only. So instead of 80 projects and 80 projects for the start state and 80 projects for the final state, which actually makes it 160, now we have only two workspaces, which means that I only have the starter workspace and final workspace. And for me, it's now much easier to manage those. How does this look like? I have a single monorepository, but this monorepository is my technical monorepository. It's not NX. So I'm keeping a one GitHub monorepo in which I'm actually having two NX workspaces, one for start and one for final. And it's important for you to look at the architecture of the folder structure of this monorepository. So each workspace, that is start and final, has different folders for each chapter, which makes it really easy for the reader to go and navigate through the workspace and finding code when they need it. And each chapter then has every single recipe. And I want to tell you out of the bat that each recipe has a unique name, which means that the CC inputs and outputs cannot exist in another chapter because it's a very unique recipe throughout the book. So that makes things easy, but also tough when we talk about Angular and when we talk about creating folders within a workspace. So this came with a challenge. If I tried to create an application using NX and I said, hey, npx NX generate an Angular application inside this folder. So I'm giving the folder name chapter1 and ccng on changes. When I do this, it actually generates an app, but the name becomes chapter1 ccng on changes. So it essentially takes all the folders. If I had multiple folders nested here in this command, then they would also become the part of the app name. And if you talk about the readers of this book, I don't really want them to remember the chapter names or even to write the chapter names. Because if we can make lives easier, if they can only write the name of the application, I think that's a win. And that's what my target was. So they would have to write the chapter name and as well as the other app name as well. And if I go forward, this is the problem. Now, if we talk about the situation where we have all the unique names, having them remember everything, I don't think that's a good idea. So the question is, can we do better? What are the possibilities? What are the possible solutions in this case? I thought of two different solutions. One was, can we exclude the chapter name when we are creating the project? So when we are creating a new Angular project within the monorepository, can I reduce the chapter name? That was the one thing. And that happens when we are creating this. Another solution is it possible for me to create the project first and then rename the project somehow? And that was the whole idea. Now, I could not really find any particular way of sort of stopping NX to remove the chapter name when I'm creating those. So I went with the other solution. And what I used for that is called NX plugin. So I needed to have some automation inside my whole workspace for the code base. And for that, in order to host everything, I opted for creating an NX plugin myself. And this plugin would contain different things that we will use. So I ended up creating the NX plugin to rename my application after it has been created. And this is sort of the architecture. So I would use the NX plugin with two different things. One is the generator and second is the executor. Now, if I go back to the previous situation where we would be creating the application, you will notice that I ran initially this command that was npx NX generator narwhal Angular application. This is NX's default generator that we use to create Angular application. But I opted for creating my own generator, which in turn would call this, but with my configuration, and then would do some more magic, would add some spice to it. So when I created the plugin, I essentially used the generator to generate the application and add the executor to the project's JSON so I can use it later on. So the idea was generate the application first, and in the process, add the executor that I want to run for renaming the application in the generation process. So the first step is the generator creates the application and adds the JSON in the project JSON, or adds the executor in the project JSON. And the code looks like this. This is my generator's code. When we have this function executed throughout the generation process, it essentially goes to the configuration or the projects.json and then adds this rename block into the targets. So this adds the rename executor right here. Now you will notice two things here. This is the executor script that my generator will run later on, but then it needs two different things, two parameters, so to say. One is the chapter, and the second one is the app name. And I'm providing this in the project JSON, so when I'm renaming, I can split down or remove the chapter, and I can still keep the app name. So just to make it easier for the rename script later on. And when we create this, for example, if I created the ng on changes project, in the end, the project JSON would contain exactly this thing. So the chapter would contain value chapter 1, and the app would contain the name. And you can already see how this is working. So initially, we had the name generated as chapter 1 dash cc ng on changes. Now I can basically strip them off. So the second part of this was the plugin executing or using the executor to rename. And for renaming, it would take out the parameters from the project JSON. And this is the code for renaming. So it essentially goes and gets the project JSON. When it reads it, it essentially replaces everything and replaces the chapter name dash app name with just the app name. And that basically results in renaming the project. So the idea is that the reader in the end could run this particular command. They could run npm run create, and then when I run, sorry, this is the command that I would run to create. So I would run this create command with chapter name. I would run this app name and then the title. And this is a bash script that I ended up creating. So my bash script, when I run npm run create, it would run this bash script and it would run the generator first and then the executor. And this is sort of the gist of the bash script. I have not included the whole bash script, but you will get the idea. When I run the bash script using npm run create, it comes into this bash script and then it takes out a couple of things. It takes out the app name. It also takes out the chapter. And essentially, it runs this command to create everything. In the end, I would have just run this, and this would generate the app project for me. And this is the target project structure that I showed before. If you see here, we have the final workspace, and we have the start workspace. When I run this command, I want to create inside my start folder or start workspace a chapter folder, and then the project name. Now, even if I have the chapter folder here, the goal was when renaming to not have this in the project JSON or end up in the app name. So I can run nx serve just the app name and not the chapter name. And all of this was done to be able to do just this. So it's a lot of work, but to me, it makes the lives easier for the readers so they don't have to put chapter name every time here. So in the end, they would just have to run nx serve cc on changes, nx serve ng drag and drop, nx serve, CDK stepper API, so just the app name. Or they could run npm run serve, which is something that I've put in the book. So they essentially run npm run serve and then just the name, and that's pretty much it. If they wanted to run both the start and final projects, I've also created a bash script to just provide this both parameter at the end with the same command, and then it would spin up both the start and final. So you can see that this is making the lives easier for the readers to just run the commands very, very easily. I faced another problem while working with this whole scenario. When we want to create multiple projects, and when you have 80 projects, we talked about what happens if I want to keep the UI UX consistent throughout all the applications. Now you can imagine that I have a structure for my applications, and this is the structure. I want to have a header up top, which should have the Angular logo, which should have the title of the application, and then an info button that takes them to the thank you page for buying the book. And then in here, we have the actual content of the application. Now, if you look at this, the same header should go in all recipes, and this content is the one that is dynamic. Now, what is the solution if I want to create this? I opted on going with something including a library and the generator. And I'm going to talk about why the library is important in this case. I created a UI library in which I put the header. So when I'm generating the application, I can use the same header component and then, or the same header, so to say, and then just move it around. So if I go forward, this is the header component that we are talking about. Then if we move forward, this is the whole flow. We have the NX plugin that uses my generator. So when I'm creating an application, it uses the NX generator, and then it uses inside the library to create the header component. And I'm going to show you how that looks. So when we run this particular command, npm run create, blah, 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 it is dissected into a couple of things. When we run npm run create, it runs a bash script. Then it takes the chapter number as the first parameter or the first argument. And then this is the app name. And then you provide a title in the quotations. All of these things are important. And the title goes inside the header for the structure that I just showed you. And this is my configuration. I have some templates that I use in my generator. So whenever a new application is generated, it goes into the HTML and adds a couple of things. For example, Tailwind CSS, some fonts, whatever I need in all of my application is inside this template. And same goes for the app itself. So the Angular app component template looks like this. I have basically my header in here, and this is having an image of the Angular logo. It uses the title that I'm using in the bash script, and then there's the info button. And I'm going to talk about this in just a bit. But what about styles? If I just have some HTML sort of being copied to the newly created application, how do I ensure that the whole layout is consistent in terms of CSS as well? So what I ended up creating was, in my plugin, I created a global.scss inside my library. So in my Angular or Angular Cookbook UI library, NGCB UI library, I ended up creating a SCSS file. And then what I did was, in my package, I'm exporting this style file as well, which means that now this is going to be available to all the application. If they just do node modules, this library, and then the global SCSS, they will find it really easily. So there were two steps involved. One, creating the SCSS file for the global styles. Second, exporting them from the library, so it's packaged. And the third step is, in my generator, when I'm trying to rename or adding a script for renaming the app, I'm also adding something in the project JSON, which is the styles. And this includes in all of my projects, the styles which are global. So every project gets the same styles. And in the future, if I needed to change anything at all, what do I need to do? I will go to my library. I will update those styles. I'll just rebuild the app or rebuild the library. And since this is automatically importing everything from the node modules and I've linked them together, all the styles would be updated in all my applications. So I have one global styles in my library, which will be updated everywhere. And I don't need to publish this on NPM or anything. It's all linked locally, which is amazing. Now, one of the challenges that I also faced with Tailwind CSS, that if I had any styles in my library, it would not work for me because my apps have Tailwind CSS configured, but not my library. So what I ended up doing was this, just trying to figure out a way of why my styles are not processing. And then what I basically did was, in my Angular library, I used this package to set up Tailwind CSS as well. This ended up having the Tailwind config created and also the Tailwind config created for the library. And then I was able to ship my styles. And this was the final output, as you can see. So all of my applications right now have the header, they have the logo, and they have the title. That's super cool. And then they also have this whole dynamic content sort of slot, which is used for all the applications. And they all are centered. So they all have the same style. So when the reader goes through different recipes, they're not like, okay, this is completely different from the previous one, or the styles are missing, or something is completely off. They all have consistent UX. All of this was going great, to be honest, until something happened. And that was around the Angular 17 launch. And this happened. Angular changed their logo. And now you can imagine what would have happened. I was left with 80 projects having a hard-coded logo, and that was a disaster. So if you remember my generator of app template, I had the image tag using this hard-coded source attribute. And when generating the applications, all my applications essentially got this toolbar with this hard coded logo, which means that I had to go to each particular project, replace this whole code manually, and use the new logo. And as you can imagine, this is what I was feeling like, that now I have to do a lot of work, even if I have NX. If you ask about what the goal was in this case, is to go from this, where we are having a toolbar that has a hard coded image and the title and the info button, to be something like this, where I could have the header component, one single component, and I could just use the templates right there. Because if I needed to change anything else at all, let's say add anything on top of the header, I would have to redo everything on 80 projects. I don't want to do that. So this was the goal. So having the HTML like this and having the template something like this. So each new application has an app component created, which has the header component imported. And that means that the header component will be used in the template as well. So this should work just like this. But as you can imagine, as I'm thinking about all of this, I'm already too late because I cannot now use my generator. This code that you see is for the generators. This is when I create a new recipe for my readers. And once I've created a recipe, I don't create it again. So if I'm updating my generator code, it is still too late because I already have all the projects. Now, what I need to really do is to replace all the headers somehow. So as I mentioned, I already had created the apps, so I could not use the generators in this particular case. So what did I do then? What is the solution? NX has something called migrations, which you can apply to the whole project, and it uses a similar concept like executors. So when we run executors, we run a Node.js script essentially, which goes into the project and takes the project tree, which contains all the folders and all the files, and then you can do manipulation on base of that. So the goal was in our case to use the NX migration to go both into the start and the final workspaces and replace all the instances of the headers. That was our goal. So what I ended up doing was I wrote an NX migration script that would replace all the toolbars in the projects. And I quickly want to just show you the migration and how it looked like. So if I go to my code base, this is how it looks like. So here, if you look at this, you can see that I have a script, which is pretty straightforward. And if I just show you the gist of it, it goes ahead and it takes out first the toolbar, and then it replaces the toolbar with ngcb UI header. That's one part of the puzzle. So I need to replace the header in both the template, but then I also need to add that to the TypeScript file as well. So I do that later on in here, and I add essentially the header component as an import in that particular file. And I also add that to the imports of the Angular application. So that's what this whole commit did. Alrighty. So that means that I was really able to do something interesting, and that is replacing the whole code. But in order for the migration to happen, you need to do two different things. One, you need to create this migration script, and I already showed you the file for it. The next thing that you want to do is to create a migration.json. So my package or my plugin, which is ng cookbook recipe, inside that I created a migrations.json, and inside that I added this generator and named it replace app toolbar. This is going to be executed by NX if I set up everything correctly. And that means I'm telling here if the version of the plugin that I'm using in my workspace is 0.0.2 or above, that's when I have to run this migration, and I'm giving the path of the migration file as well. Which means that if I just go in my workspace and run NX run migration or NX migrate run migrations, it will automatically run all the migrations for me and replace all the toolbars. So that happened, and finally I was able to run the migrations and I could replace all the headers. So if I show you this right now on what the migrations look like or what the commit looked like, I think you'll be really amazed. So in here, you'll see that we are at start apps, and here we are at chapter 1. And in chapter 1, the only two files are updated that are the HTML and the module.ts. So in the HTML, you can see we replaced all of our template with just the ngCBI UI header. That is the component that we used. And in the app.module.ts, we imported the header component and we also imported the header component in the imports of the module. So some of the applications used standalone components, some of them did not. So in some of the cases, you will see that we only updated the app component TS and not the module.ts. But regardless, we were able to go into the whole project and I could run just one script and it would run everything for me. I don't have to do this manually. And this is the final result that I want to show you. If I look at the final thing that now the readers see, this is what they see now. We have the new logo. Yay! We also have the title and we have the app running inside that. And you can see how cool this is. I can essentially drag and drop this in here. I could move this here and go inside and see all the values here as well. And then in the future, since I already ran this migration and I'm using a component, I could also add this cool thing here as well. So more components or more updates can be done now easily with all this magic that we have talked about. So having said that, let's summarize what we have talked about. We moved over 80 projects to just 2 workspaces using NX. That's super cool. We also discussed how NX generator works when you want to scaffold new projects. So you have a template that you can use, and that template is going to be used everywhere. We also discussed how you can run NX executors to run something after your projects have been created, or even the projects have been created, but they help us make changes to the project or the files themselves. We also discussed how we can export global styles using a library and then using them or using the NX generators to apply them to all the projects that we create. And finally, we also talked about how to compile the Tailwind CSS styles. One more thing that I've not mentioned here is that we also discuss about how NX migrations can help us do, a lot of significant changes in the whole project and can help us recover from disasters, so to say. So that's the whole summary. And with that, I would like to thank you for DevDays Europe for inviting me for this talk. I hope this was helpful for you and you learned something. You can also go to the GitHub project because it's public. If you search for Angular Cookbook Second Edition, you're going to find the GitHub link for this. And you can inspect the code base and you can check it out. If you have any question, just write an issue there or reach out to me on my socials. And you can find me on Twitter as well at codewith_Ahsan. With that said, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to go now for them. Thank you. Awesome. That sounds good then. So thank you so much, everyone who joined, and feel free to reach out on any socials. And thank you. Have a great rest of the conference.